What if I told you that Russia's most powerful weapon isn't a nuclear missile or cyber attack, but an idea? Not one that conquers by force, but by erosion. It doesn't crash through the front door. It slips through the cracks. It whispers, everyone's corrupt. Nothing is real. Your enemy is your neighbor. Hi, I'm Elvira Bary. I was born in the USSR, and today I want to show you how the Kremlin, first under the Soviets, now under Putin, has spent over a century eating away at the moral foundation of the West using what I call the termite strategy. Like termites inside a house, you don't notice this strategy at first. It's quiet, invisible, but it slowly hollows out the structural beams of democracy, truth, trust, shared reality, until the entire system becomes so fragile it can collapse under its own weight. This strategy has shaped wars, protests, conspiracy movements, even presidential elections. And if you think it's only about Russia, think again. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just how it works, but why it's winning. But before Russia could attack the West, it had to convince itself it was righteous. Let's start there. Before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Russia was one of Europe's imperial powers. Sometimes it cooperated with its neighbors, sometimes it went to war with them. What made Russia unique was its vast territory, brutal climate, abundance of natural resources, and a major lack of infrastructure. Few roads, few ports. It was a country rich in raw materials, but poor in ways to export them. Then came World War I, and Russia's economy collapsed along with its state institutions. In the chaos, power fell into the hands of a small but tightly organized political party whose goal wasn't just to fix Russia. They wanted global revolution. This is a critical point that people often forget when studying Russian history. The entire early Soviet worldview was built on the belief that capitalism was obsolete and that socialism triumph was inevitable. History, they thought, was marching toward one final conclusion, and it was their sacred duty to help it along. It wasn't just a political project, it was a kind of religious faith. They didn't question it, they didn't doubt it. I have a separate video where I explain why Bolshevism is such a strange offshoot of Christianity and how it functioned almost exactly like a cult. You might want to check it out. It explains a lot. The Bolsheviks claimed to speak on behalf of the working class. Only they said, truly cared about workers and peasants. Only they wanted to create real democracy and true equality. Their message resonated. In the early 20th century, the world was suffering from brutal labor exploitation, no workplace protections, no social safety nets. Much of the globe was still colonized, oppressed by racism and imperial rule. The people at the top didn't want anything to change, but the people at the bottom were desperate for a way out. That's why the Bolsheviks' ideas sounded so appealing to so many. End exploitation and class privilege. Redistribute wealth more fairly. Reject racism. Protect the working majority from abuse by the powerful. Offer free healthcare and social support to all. This was how socialism looked through the eyes of early 20th century political thinkers. And honestly, those ideas sounded pretty great. It's easy to see why so many educated people supported them. They weren't blind. They could see how unjust the system around them really was. But what happens when utopia runs out of money and blame becomes the only fuel left? The problem with building a socialist utopia in Russia was simple. There was no money. The country was broke. The vast majority of the population were impoverished peasants who dreamed of private wealth, not collective ownership. And the only way the new Bolshevik regime could fund its grand project was by squeezing squeezing the people even harder than the Tsarist government had. At first, the Bolsheviks had high hopes. They believed that after World War I, socialist revolutions would erupt across Western Europe. Once that happened, wealthier nations would surely come to Russia's aid and help build the socialist dream. But that revolution never came. Instead, the opposite happened. Western governments, terrified by the chaos of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, finally woke up. Slowly, they began to introduce reforms: labor protections, universal suffrage, the minimal social safety nets to ease tensions and prevent their own uprisings. Russia had been expected solidarity. What it got was a trade blockade. Western nations refused to do business with the new Bolshevik regime. Why? Because it had defaulted on the massive debts racked up by the Tsarist government loans, wartime weapons shipments, and the complete expropriation of foreign-owned businesses after the revolution. In short, Russia stopped paying its bills, and the world shut its doors. Russian cities fell into steep decline. In 1917, many people had hoped that life would improve, but by the early 1920s, it was obvious things were far worse than they'd been in 1913, before the war. The Bolsheviks, now entrenched in power, were faced with a choice: admit they had failed or blame the West. They chose option 2. According to the new Soviet narrative, it wasn't socialism that was failing, it was foreign sabotage. The evil capitalist West wasn't just refusing to trade with Russia, it was actively sending saboteurs to destroy the people's economy. In reality, the collapse came from within. Equipment wore out and couldn't be replaced. Besides that, Russia lacked skilled professionals because the Bolsheviks had either executed them or driven them into exile. But the myth of a Western conspiracy was politically useful. It turned failure into betrayal and gave the regime an enemy to rally against. And that's where the termite strategy truly begins. Of course, the Bolsheviks had no intention of giving up power. Instead, the Kremlin doubled down on its mission: to fight the cursed capitalist West by spreading revolution abroad. The ultimate goal? A global alliance of socialist republics where richer, more developed countries would help poorer ones build the communist future. To make that dream a reality, the Soviet government launched a three-pronged strategy. First, they focused on supporting labor movements and trade unions in industrialized countries, especially in Britain and Germany. This wasn't just ideological cheerleading. The Soviets spent real money to fund foreign strikes, helping workers hold out longer in hopes of winning better conditions. It was direct financial support for revolution from abroad. Second, they targeted the most vulnerable part of the capitalist system, the colonies. In the 1920s, that meant China. With its massive population and rich cultural history, China saw itself as a great civilization. Western colonial powers did not care. They exploited the country and treated the Chinese as inferiors. Naturally, China was ripe for a national liberation movement, and the Soviets were eager to light the match. They fueled internal tensions, hoping for civil war that would drive out Western imperialists and bring China into the Soviet orbit. I explore this in more details in my novel The White Ghost's Empire. The link is in the description. The same playbook was used in other colonies too, though on a smaller scale. Revolutionary activism was expensive, and Russia was still poor. Third, the Soviet Union worked to win the hearts and minds of the Western educated elite. The strategy was simple: invite prominent journalists and writers to visit the USSR. Roll out the red carpet, take them on carefully staged tours of major industrial projects, show them a land of progress, unity, and growth. Naturally, they were never shown the Gulag camps. They didn't visit starving villages. That side of the story was completely hidden. These guests returned home full of admiration. They wrote glowing articles and books, gave talks and interviews describing the Soviet miracle they thought they had witnessed. And in the middle of the Great Depression, their stories were intoxicating. But what those foreign writers didn't see, or didn't want to see, would shape the next 70 years of global politics. To many in the West, it seemed obvious. Capitalism was crumbling, and the USSR was building something bold, new, and successful. Pro-Soviet friendship societies popped up across Europe and America. Propaganda newspapers and magazines funded by Moscow were published globally, celebrating the so-called triumphs of socialism. At the same time, the USSR sealed itself off. Foreigners were rarely allowed in, and when they were watched closely by the secret police. You couldn't bring in or out written materials or photographs without approval from the Soviet censors. So Western intellectuals were only exposed to a carefully curated version of Soviet reality. How did this information control work in practice? How did Stalin's secret police manage and manipulate the handful of foreign journalists in Moscow? I explore all of this in my novel The Prince of the Soviets. Soviet hostility toward the West wasn't just driven by ideology or politics. There was another layer, one far more cynical and deeply human: money, privilege, and power. You see, the people carrying out the Kremlin's covered missions abroad weren't ordinary citizens. They were part of the Soviet elite. These agents earned salaries in foreign currency. They traveled freely, shopped in Western stores, and enjoyed luxuries most people in the USSR could not even dream of. And most importantly, they were relatively safe. Far from Moscow, they operated with much more freedom. Their lives were not only more comfortable, but also significantly happier than those of their colleagues trapped inside the Soviet system. And yes, they stole constantly. If you were given funds to organize a strike in Philadelphia, you knew one thing for sure: your boss in Moscow would never be able to verify how the money was actually spent. You could submit a glowing report about a heroic labor uprising and pocket most of the cash. No one could double-check how much you really paid for flyers or whether you even rented that safe house. To keep your job, you just had to make sure your superior in Moscow stayed happy. That usually meant sending him regular gifts, bought with the same funds meant for the revolution. For Kremlin agents, it was absolutely critical to convince the higher-ups that their work was vital, effective, and making progress. Because if the leadership started to think otherwise, you'd be called back to Russia to rot in some bleak, poverty-stricken provincial office. It's a strange irony. On the outside, Soviet intelligence services looked terrifying, but inside, they were often little more than a network of grifters, each one trying to secure a better post, more perks, and more funding. To keep the money flowing, they needed the West to remain the enemy. They inflated threats, exaggerated their own successes, and constantly demanded more resources for their missions. In that atmosphere, any belief of ideals, socialism, justice, even patriotism, slowly died. What replaced them was cold, bitter cynicism. And that cynicism didn't just infect the KGB, it became its guiding ideology and was passed down to its successor, the FSB, the heart of Putin's modern regime. The West lifted its trade blockade on the Soviet Union during the Great Depression, not out of sympathy, but out of desperation. Western countries were in urgent need of cheap resources, and Stalin was ready to sell. Soviet raw materials flooded global markets at rock-bottom prices. But there was a reason they were so cheap. They were extracted using forced labor. And that didn't just mean Gulag prisoners. Even free Soviet citizens worked long, grueling hours for extremely low pay. Stores were nearly empty because every resource in the country was being funneled into one thing: expanding the military-industrial complex. Nazi Germany, for example, was able to resurrect its industrial base, partly thanks to Soviet shipments of low-cost raw materials. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Dust Bowl was crippling American agriculture. The Soviets saw a golden business opportunity, and they took it. Soviet grain produced by starving peasants was exported abroad. In regions like Ukraine, famine was devastating entire communities, but the USSR still prioritized foreign sales. Why? Because the Soviet regime desperately needed hard currency. It used that money to buy machinery and pay Western engineers to build dozens of major industrial plants. But cheap goods weren't always enough to seal the deal. To ensure that foreign politicians and business leaders stayed cooperative and quiet, the USSR built an entire system of bribery and secret arrangements. Some people were paid in cash, others were courted ideologically. Still others received lavish gifts, rare artifacts seized from Russian churches and museums. There was always a way to win someone over. The system didn't just corrupt Western elites, it also deeply corrupted the Soviet elite. You see, these Soviet agents and officials mostly interacted with people who were willing to do business with them, people who could be bought. Over time, they came to believe a dangerous idea that everyone has a price. To them, principles didn't exist. Morality was negotiable. Integrity was an illusion. All that mattered was finding the right number. And this worldview, the belief that everything and everyone is for sale, still shapes how Russia's political elite sees the West today. They genuinely believe that Western values are fake, that democracy is a performance, and that with the right offer, anyone can be bought. That belief isn't just dangerous, it's contagious. Stalin had a plan, a bold, calculated plan. He believed he could build a massive military and industrial machine, manipulate Hitler into destroying Europe's democracies, and let Nazi Germany exhaust itself in the process. Then, once the dust settled, the Soviet army would simply roll in and take over the continent. But that plan collapsed. Hitler, wildly overconfident, decided that instead of cooperating with Stalin, he'd invade the Soviet Union and turn it into a resource base for his war against Britain and the United States. This was a fatal mistake. German intelligence, it turned out, had serious gaps, especially in geography. Hitler and his generals had no realistic understanding of the sheer size of the USSR. They didn't grasp how few railroads there were, how brutal the winters could be, or how stretched their supply lines would become. German soldiers marched into Russia without winter coats, no fur-lined boots, no real preparation for sub-zero warfare. In the 20th century, war weren't won by courage alone. They were won with resources and logistics. And in that department, the Germans were not ready. While the war was raging, the USSR loudly celebrated its friendship with the Allies. But behind the scenes, Soviet spies were hard at work gathering secrets from those same allies. And they rarely did the spying themselves. More often, they recruited foreigners, Westerners, who could be blackmailed, bribed, or, best of all, ideologically seduced. That last option was especially effective. In the 1930s and 40s, the West was full of well-educated, well-meaning idealists. These were privileged people who romanticized socialism from a distance. They were deeply disillusioned with capitalism and convinced that by helping Stalin, they were fighting for a better world. They weren't spies in the traditional sense. They genuinely thought they were on the right side of history. Thanks to them, thanks to Stalin's secrets and ideological blindness, the USSR got the atomic bomb. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet dream of global revolution had crumbled. Europe hadn't fallen, capitalism hadn't collapsed, and Soviet citizens could see with their own eyes, through whispers, contrabanded magazines, or glimpses of embassy life, that the West, for all its flaws, offered a higher standard of living than socialism ever had. This created an uncomfortable dilemma for the Soviet elite. Western workers, supposedly oppressed, were clearly living better than Soviet citizens. Worse still, any association with the West, say a posting at an embassy or a job involving foreign trade, instantly elevated your social status. That was hard to explain under a system that claimed capitalism was dying. So, with the dream of world domination fading, the Soviet regime pivoted. If the USSR couldn't conquer the West, it would at least make sure the West couldn't conquer the world either. That's why, during the second half of the 20th century, the Soviet Union poured its resources into fighting for influence in the so-called Third World. If a dictator in Africa or Asia pledged loyalty to Moscow, the USSR would gladly arm and support him, no matter how brutal his regime. Why support North Korea? Because the alternative was letting America dominate the Korean peninsula, while fuel decades of Arab-Israeli conflict. Because Israel turned its back on the USSR and embraced the United States, despite Soviet military and political support during Israel's early years. And toward the West itself, Russian policy became brutally cynical. If we can't win in open competition, we'll rot them from the inside. When people think of the Cold War, they imagine nuclear arms, spy thrillers, and tanks in Eastern Europe. But the KGB wielded a far cheaper and more insidious weapon: disinformation. Now, they did not try to convince Americans to love communism. Their goal was to dismantle trust itself, to make truth feel impossible, to paint all causes as corrupt, all heroes as hypocrites, all values as illusions. If everyone is a liar, no one can be held accountable. The strategy had two purposes. First, to prevent Soviet citizens from looking west and demanding democracy. Second, to weaken the West by turning its people against one another. Take the American civil rights movement. Racial injustice was real, and the KGB knew it. They forged racist letters, spread lies about civil rights leaders, and amplified real pain into explosive distrust. In Vietnam, Soviet operatives circulated horrifying stories about US war crimes. Some were true, others were fiction. All were crafted to radicalize protesters, delegitimize the war, and erode faith in the military. And then came the universities. Soviet influence campaigns did not stop with political crisis. They moved into academia, art, and philosophy. Marxist thinkers, left-wing intellectuals, and critics of capitalism were quietly supported and celebrated because their ideas planted doubt in the minds of future Western leaders. The message was always the same: believe nothing, trust no one, all systems are corrupt. Once someone accepted that idea, they felt clever, enlightened, like they finally saw the world for what it really was. And they were praised for it by professors, peers, and self-styled rebels. But in reality, this worldview isolated them. It stripped them of hope, purpose, and moral clarity. It made them bitter, suspicious, and easy to manipulate. In the long run, that's exactly what the Soviets wanted. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it seems like mutual hostility was over. The Cold War was history, and a new Russia could join the global system. But it did not take long for the new Russian elite to realize something unsettling. The West did not accept them. Western governments expected things like free elections and independent courts. The European Court of Human Rights had the audacity to make Russia compensate victims of state abuse. Worse, Western journalists kept asking pesky questions like, Where is all this money coming from? To Russia's new ruling class? This was outrageous. None of your business. You see, the real conflict was not about ideology anymore. It was about power and ownership. Russian elites believed they had an unspoken right to exploit their own people and extract whatever wealth they wanted from Russian territory. In their eyes, this was their domain. Just as kings once ruled by divine right, they ruled by post Soviet inheritance. The West, they felt, had no right to interfere. But some Western leaders did not look the other way. Not all of them, of course, but enough to cause friction. And from the Kremlin's perspective, this was betrayal. You're just as corrupt as we are, they said. Don't pretend you're any better. The fair world order is simple. We divide the map, respect each other's borders and spheres of influence, and make deals when it's convenient. Don't lecture us on morals. When the West refused to play by those rules, Russia returned to what it knew best: undermine its enemies from within. Putin's operatives began turning the West's own core principles against it. Freedom of speech? Use it to flood the public square with lies. Pluralism? Use it to amplify extremist fringe voices. Tolerance? Twist it into an excuse for defending authoritarian regimes. The Kremlin didn't care about left or right. It backed extremists on both sides of the spectrum. All that mattered was destabilization. Wherever they found cracks, distrust in institutions, anger at elites, fear of globalization, they sent in narrative saboteurs. Not to win hearts and minds, but to confuse them, to divide them, to make the entire system feel rotten and irredeemable. By the early 2010s, Russia no longer needed trained agents slipping envelopes across border. They had something better: X, Facebook, Reddit, and YouTube. Thousands of Kremlin-backed trolls, working in shifts around the clock, posed as Americans, Europeans, South Americans, anyone, everyone. Their goal was not to persuade, it was to inflame. One fake account played a Black Lives Matter activist. Another pretended to be a coal miner defending his job. Another posed as a radical Greenpeace member. Some memes mocked the idea of voting. Others spread false claims about political candidates. Still others pushed conspiracy theories about vaccines, school shootings, racial violence, religious hatred, anything that could divide, terrify, or paralyze society. During the 2016 US presidential elections, Russia launched one of the most visible and effective narrative attacks in modern history. And even after US intelligence agencies confirmed it, millions refused to believe it, or shrugged it off as no big deal. In Europe, Russia stoked anti-immigrant fear, boosted support for Brexit, and flooded feeds with vaccine misinformation and anti-NATO statement. In Africa, they spread conspiracy theories about Western exploitation while quietly pushing Russian arms and mining deals. In Latin America, they backed populist movements aimed at destabilization pro-Western governments. And it worked, because Russia's weapon is not logic. It's emotion, fear, anger, resentment. When people feel threatened, humiliated, or betrayed, they don't pause to verify sources. They lash out. They retreat into tribalism. They reject uncomfortable truths and cling to comfortable lies. Liberal democracies are fragile, not because they lack strength, but because they depend on shared reality. We don't need to argue on every policy, but we must agree on basic facts: what an election means, what the law says, what the truth is. Without that, democracy can't function. If every side sees the other not as wrong, but as evil, then compromise becomes betrayal. And into that vacuum steps either chaos or authoritarianism. Will Putin's regime continue its termed strategy? Absolutely. It's not just a tactic, it's a survival mechanism. Russia depends on foreign trade because it cannot produce complex goods on its own. If the West were to unite and make democratic reform a non negotiable condition for doing business, the Russian elite would be cornered. But so far, Putin has managed to keep the world divided, and he is no longer alone. Other authoritarian regimes have watched his success and are learning from his playbook. What makes the termite strategy so dangerous is not that it shouts, it whispers. It doesn't need you to believe in Russia, it only needs you to stop believing in everything else. And when that happens, democracy doesn't need to be overthrown. It simply collapses under the weight of doubt. If you found this video insightful or worth thinking about, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it. It truly helps the channel grow. And if you'd like to support my work directly, you can click the join button, give a super thanks, or buy me a coffee using the link below. Your support means more than I can say. Thank you for being part of this journey.